Hello, Rowan here. I was asked to show how to draw the human form in perspective, like with foreshortening, and it's like the hardest thing to do, so that's fun. Drawing the human figure in perspective is tricky both in practice and in learning how to do it, because every person is built differently. So there isn't like a set how-to in that sense. There's just general ideas and good practice. So I'm going to show you two examples of functionally incorrect perspective. One that's not on purpose, and one that was done that way for a reason. And then I'll show you some general drawing tips before we go on to pieces of the human body in perspective. I'm going to do my best to explain a coil technique that I actually don't use personally. But you know what? We're going to go. We're going to do it. I believe in us. Let's go. So our first example is by Raul Canestro. Hope I said that right. Sorry, I failed Spanish. Almost failed Spanish 3 times. Anyway, this is a great example of objectively incorrect, but it's also a guy known mostly for cubism, in his defense, and he's great at that. Like, look him up, he's fantastic. And also, this is considered a great and important piece of religious art, so I'm sorry in advance. Obviously, this isn't the worst thing happening to him in this picture, but I need to mention that his feet are so small and his head is enormous. So let's see if we can correct that a little bit. If we enlarge his feet, like I'm doing here, and let's also smallerize his head a little bit, it starts to look more correct. See, you have to think about where he would be if he were standing up, what he would look like, and then when we make that more compact, when we squish it down, as well as turn it, so his head is farther away from us and thus smaller, and his feet are bigger because they're closer to us, what does that wind up looking like on this figure? I'm also messing with his arm here, because elbows typically are around the waist, but we're also foreshortening. So what does that look like? I feel like I'm bullying this man. Not just Jesus, but Raul. I don't know him personally. I'm sure he's a great guy. Still around. But yeah, look up his cubism. Beautiful stuff. And cubism, by nature, is 2D. You're not playing in the 3D space as much. It is a very different thing. Because you're flattening everything, right? So our other example, though, is Michelangelo's David. We're just not going to look at the part that YouTube wouldn't want you to look at. And this is an example that's technically the same issues, but it was on purpose. And obviously in 3D, because it's a sculpture. It's designed so that you can look at it from underneath and it'll still look correct despite it being actually far away, right? Michelangelo knew enough about the human form that he was able to confidently and expertly mess with proportions on David. This was all done on purpose. So again, so you can see him from underneath and have him look normal despite him being huge. He looks extremely odd from other angles, and many replications of David tend to correct for these things so that he still looks right. But the use of space and how the human eye works, that's what makes Michelangelo's David masterful. So, let's look at how to practice looking at the human form. What I mean is, you can start with a photograph, but looking at people in real life is going to allow you to avoid that flattening in a 2D picture, because you're obviously going to have that to begin with. If it's a 2D picture, you may think that would simplify the process, but our eyes see the way they see, and the flat is, well, flat. So you may think you're looking at a picture straight on, but it's actually tilted in a way to change the perspective to begin with. So what we're looking at here is the human form perspective. So let's take a second to review what that means. Typically we're talking about perspective in art. We're looking at objects in a room or drawing a town on a horizon line, that kind of thing. And those same principles will work for us in drawing people too. So as a quick review, we're going to talk about 1-point, 2-point, and 3-point perspective. And all this is determined by the point of view you're trying to draw and helps us keep in mind that the 2D drawing is trying to depict a 3D space. So we have our horizon line, we have our vanishing point. This is for 1 point perspective, so literally there is one vanishing point. And that line, that horizon line, like if we're thinking sky versus floor or whatever, it's also just our level, how we're seeing somebody. So we have our object, and then we have our lines from our vanishing point that goes to the object, and then we draw on those two lines, between those two lines, we're going to have another of that, the rest of that object. I'm not explaining that well. But you're going to keep in mind these 4 lines for a whole shape. It'll be easier when I draw a cube instead. But it works for a tube, it works for other things as well. Because then you're seeing that smaller, farther away, bigger is closer. That's all that means. I overcomplicated it. Okay. I'm not using a ruler. And that's a rhombus, not a square, but it's fine. And these are not straight lines either. But this is going to make sense, because this is how you're going to do it for things that are not perfect geometric shapes as well. But in order to make it so we understand, farther away is smaller, larger is closer to us. My smushed cube. My sad smushed cube. So that was 1 point's perspective. And now we move on to 2 point. Right? We're going to start with our horizon line again. Listen, that's as straight of a line as I can draw freehand. I could use all kinds of tools. I'm not gonna. So 2 points. 1, 2. 2 points for our 2 point perspective. Excitement. Now we're gonna get into kind of a grid situation, because instead of the 1 point becoming lines, you now have 2 points to meet up and make those lines. All of this is easier with a ruler. But yeah, you want to make the lines continue on past, so that in either direction you can continue your shape. And I'm just drawing the other lines behind just to show you that it would continue behind this object. This is a solid object we're drawing here, but like, this is just good practice regardless of what you're drawing. You should be doing this to practice, to figure things out before you try to draw, like, a human form or anything more complicated than a box. Because as you can see, boxes can be hard if you, I don't know, this off time, can't draw a straight line to save your life. Straight lines are, this is why we have rulers. Maybe it's a gelatinous cube, I don't know. You don't know. We don't know this cube. I don't know his story, his life. This cube has a wife and children. We made a cube. Huzzah. Let's do another one. What happens from 2 point perspective? I want to point out, I was never a teacher for a living. I was a counselor. You know, to talk about your feelings, I'm better at that. Oh, yeah, see, if that left line were, like, parallel at all, if there was, but I'm tapering it. This is a terrible example. You understand, I hope, what it is I'm trying to do here. I hope you understand. I hope this makes sense on any level. Welp. These aren't cubes, they're rectangular prisms. That's a fun term for you. Let's just leave those cubes behind. Because even cleaned up, these are horrible. I'm sorry. You know, use a ruler, use the tools available to you in digital programs that I am not using. So, horizon line. 1, 2, and so for a 3 point perspective, where does the 3 come in? Here's the 3. And we're just gonna start connecting stuff. I know technically speaking, I use 3 point perspective when I'm drawing. Do I think about it this way? No, I don't. Is it useful to think about it this way? Probably. These are fundamentals you should know before you're trying to do anything else. Because if you have the building blocks of this, of basic anatomy, of how to do gesture drawing, if you have those basics, everything else is gonna be easier because you've got the building blocks. You know, you've got a foundation to hold everything on top of. Look, there's a nice little cube in the... See, that's a better cube, isn't it? That's better. It has the scaffolding to hold it together. Oh, well, anyway. I hope any of this made sense. 3-point perspective. 1, 2, and 3-point perspective. You do use all of them. Now, go forth and practice this kind of stuff. Okay. So we can do this a couple of different ways. By the way, we're gonna have a little guy. Okay. Just a general... We'll pretend these are correct proportions. And... Okay. So. We have our midline. We'll say this is the horizon line. We have our shoulders. We have our waist. We have our knees, right? And our feet. So this is something to think about. This isn't really going to help you long term, because you're not necessarily going to have a figure standing up straight every single time. But let's think about it in terms of, here's the head. It's going to be bigger because it's closer to us. And then you've got the shoulders right here. And how much are you actually seeing of everything else? Probably not very much. And then there's a little bit of feet down there. Maybe even smaller. So, ultimately that's not going to help you. I've seen people try to teach this way, and I understand that it only works if you have every single part, and then you're just extrapolating from there. So instead, I'm going to show you the coil method, which I think is a useful tool. Although again, this is hard because I don't know what figure you're drawing. But I'm also going to talk about gesture drawing. When you're doing a gesture, it's very loose. And this is how you're going to do it when you're looking at a subject very specifically. Something is in front of you and you want it on paper. So when we're talking about the coil method, we're talking about like the same thing that we just did with the 1, 2, and 3-point perspective. In that, here's our guy from above again. We're looking at, here's the width of his shoulders versus here's the width of his feet. Meaning, again, the feet are far away and they're smaller. So just like we did with the whole grid situation we came up with before, here's far away versus here's closer. We're kind of doing that again on this figure as best as we can. But this is a whole body. And we're not really going to talk about the whole body in the coil method. We're really talking about like limbs. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that. So let's see the coil method on a limb. Gotta draw my guy. I really should just copy paste this guy over and over and over. But here's our guy. And when we're talking about the coil, it is just trying to keep in mind not only distance from the viewer, again, closer or farther away, but also trying to keep it in line with what the body would actually look like. The coil technique really only works if you already understand some kind of anatomy and understand the way things compress. So the arm is going to be shorter if it's lifted toward you. And yeah, you start rough, and then you kind of go back in to finalize what you did. Then detail. If we want to lift up this leg, make it like he's marching or running. Thigh and knee is going to get bigger because they're toward us. And then we have the rest of the leg that goes back and gets smaller because it's going further away. I urge you to use references. I realize I'm doing this whole video and then going, yeah, but don't listen to me. In conjunction with. You should have lots and lots of tools in your belt to be doing this. That is my overall statement to you. Some people swear by the coil, and I get it, but I'm not good at it. It's not the way I personally do things. but I think it's easier to explain things with the coils. So that's what I'm trying to do. An exercise you can do is to draw an arm coming straight at you, and draw that same arm from the side, and that same arm from like a 45-degree angle view. And that'll help you have a general idea that you can then apply to other drawings later on, whether you use the coil technique or not. So I'm just going to show you here, not coils necessarily, just tube. We have a tube lifting up sort of away and toward us, right? So the one end bigger, the other end tapers off until we only see the butt. That one should be more tapered. Taper, taper, taper. Yeah. It's the same principle. It's always the same principle when we're talking about perspective. And I do think it helps to keep these things in mind. The idea of compression, the idea of bigger versus smaller because closer versus farther away. I know I'm repeating myself a lot, but it's important to keep this in mind throughout any kind of perspective you're drawing, any kind of foreshortening. It's the same amount of stuff, but you're seeing less of it. Let's try this one more time. We got our dude, got an arm, lift, and it's going to be the same because it's just straight up, right? Right to the side, rather. So our distance from this arm is the same. That's something that helps me more than using coils. I like to keep in mind where things generally go. So like, when you're standing up, your hands go to your mid-thigh, your feet are the same length as your forearms. Just, that's a fun fact. Typically, they're about the same. Your elbows are gonna rest near your waist. That helps me, because I can keep these things in mind, and then compress, and then the foreshortening happens beyond that. When you see artists, depictions of artists, and they're putting their thumb up to like compare their thumb to something they're looking at in a still life, that's what they're doing, is they're measuring what is this against something else. When I'm looking at this piece here, this vase or whatever, how big is that in comparison to the cat next to it? That's what they're measuring. Using their thumb to do that. But when you do that, you gotta keep your arm straight so that the thumb stays the same, so you don't trick yourself with your own sense of perspective, right? So, that's how I do things. I hope any of that made sense. I could also do a full video probably on anatomy, but I mean, there are people who take entire years worth courses on anatomy, so for that I would suggest to just look up some stuff on YouTube from people who have already done it better than I could possibly do it. But I do hope that this general idea of drawing in perspective has been useful to you. Rock on.